Hey guys, tonight we step into the soft-lit, velvet-curtained corridors of royal palaces, places where beauty thrived, power whispered, and women disappeared. We're diving into the secret world of medieval concubines, not the seductive figures from fairy tales, but the forgotten women behind bloodlines, betrayals, and broken vows. These weren't just lovers, they were pawns, scapegoats, sometimes ghosts in their own lives. One moment adored, the next erased. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy deep dives into the untold sides of history. And let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from tonight, and what time is it for you? It's always incredible to see the quiet corners of the world we connect from. Now, dim the lights, maybe wrap yourself in something warm, and silence the noise around you. Because tonight, we trace the footsteps of women history tried to forget and uncover the cruel fate behind the silken veil. One moment, she was just another servant girl, silent, bowed, half shadow behind a silk curtain. The next, the emperor's eyes lingered a heartbeat too long. Maybe it was the tilt of her neck, the way candlelight caught her cheek, or simply that he was bored. That glance, so casual, so meaningless to him, cracked open a door she never asked to walk through. That night, she was summoned. A warm bath, perfumed oils, new robes she'd never dreamed of touching, let alone wearing. Servants treated her like glass. She didn't eat dinner. She was prepared for it. And just like that, her name changed. No longer just the girl from the Western kitchens. Now she was the new consort. And at first, it felt like rising. The chamber she once scrubbed now held her bed. The women who once ignored her now bowed low. She had jewelry, silks, warm hands brushing her hair. Her family was sent gifts. Her name was whispered in the corridors. The empress glanced at her, not with words, but with ice behind the eyes. She had arrived. She mattered. For a time, he remembered her. She was called for often. He smiled when she spoke, laughed when she stumbled. Her favorite fruit appeared every morning. When she fell ill, royal physicians came before dawn. She was told, gently, that her presence soothed his temper, that she was good for him, that she was lucky. But power bought on beauty is a candle in the wind. The court watched. Everyone did. They smiled to her face and counted the days until she slipped. And the moment she did, when she laughed too loudly, or spoke without being asked, or was simply no longer new, the gaze that once lifted her now looked past her. A single turn of the head. A missed visit. A night alone. It didn't take much. Rumors floated fast. She was too bold, too quiet, too foreign, too manipulative. Someone said she brought bad dreams. Another claimed she was whispering poison into the emperor's ear. It didn't matter what was true. Truth was what the palace repeated enough times to make real. And so, the fall came. Her chambers were moved, smaller, colder. Her robes less fine. The servant girls no longer bowed. The fruit stopped coming. The emperor's eyes no longer searched for hers. He didn't need to explain. He simply didn't call. In some versions of this story, that's the end. A fall from favor. A quiet fading into the background. But in others, and there are too many of these, it didn't stop there. Sometimes she was accused of jealousy, of sorcery, of exerting unnatural influence. No trial, no defense, just a reassignment to a faraway estate, or a locked room. Or, worse, a disappearance no one dared question. Because once you'd been loved by power, truly touched by it, you were never safe again. You were a reminder, a risk, a loose thread to cut clean. And so, the girl who once made an emperor smile became a warning, whispered between chambermaids, written in no records, remembered only by the scent she left behind. All it took was one glance to lift her from nothing, and one moment more to erase her completely. The palace rejoiced. Bells rang. Red silk hung across the gates. Poets scribbled, hurried verses about fate and blessings and divine wombs. Servants bowed so low their foreheads touched stone. She, the once forgotten girl, now carried the bloodline. Her body had done what generations of wives and consorts sometimes failed to do, deliver a male heir. For a moment, the wind shifted. Eyes softened. Her name was spoken again, this time with awe. And yet, As her body healed, her arms remained empty, because the child wasn't hers. Not really, not anymore. The moment the cord was cut, so was her right to mother. He was taken, gently, respectfully, and absolutely, to be raised not in her chamber, not in her arms, but in the care of wet nurses, tutors, astrologers, and guards. She was told it was tradition, that heirs were too important to be raised by sentiment, that love made rulers weak. She would not name him. She would not see him except from afar. If she asked, she was told he was healthy and progressing well, but no one brought her his drawings. No one whispered his first words. The palace decided what he ate, what language he spoke, what gods he thanked, and who he was told his mother was. In some cases, the child was told it was the empress. Safer that way, simpler. She, the one who bore him, became a shadow, a necessary function, a footnote. Her body had been sacred for 9 months. Now it was just another room to be cleared. And yet, she still loved him, quietly, ferociously, from a distance. She'd sneak glimpses through silk curtains when the procession passed. She'd trace the edge of a toy she heard he favoured. Some nights, she dreamed of singing him to sleep, only to wake and find silence. Sometimes, she was allowed to see him, just once a year, in a garden, supervised, never alone. He wouldn't know who she was. He'd bow politely, call her Madam, smile with royal indifference, and she'd smile back, a smile that split her open inside. Because what kind of mother watches her child grow up a stranger? And still, it was better than the others, the ones whose sons were taken and never spoken of again, the ones who weren't even told when the child grew ill, or died, or became someone else's leverage. She gave the throne its future, and the throne gave her nothing back, except silence, and maybe, one day, a child grown into a king who wouldn't recognize the face that once risked everything just to hold him. It wasn't spoken aloud, of course. No one dared say it. Not the midwife with trembling hands, not the eunuch who rushed to report the birth, not even the guards who suddenly started watching her door more closely. But the silence was different now, tighter, loaded. A male heir meant power, not for her, never for her, but for the blood in her child's veins. And power made people nervous. The empress, who'd been barren for years. The crown prince, whose status suddenly felt fragile. The court ministers, who preferred predictability over possibility. Her son, just hours old, became a threat to everyone in line, and she, his mother, was the weak link they could remove without consequence. The first days were full of ceremony. Gifts arrived, musicians played. She smiled for the sake of the scribes recording every move. But she didn't sleep. She couldn't. Not when she woke to find her chamber guards replaced. Not when her personal maid was suddenly reassigned. Not when the soup tasted just a little too sweet. She knew. Sometimes it was poison. Sometimes a sudden illness, fever, coughing, gone by morning. Sometimes she was simply sent away, and the boat never made it to shore. And even when the death was quiet, orchestrated in shadows, the message was always the same. Thank you for the heir, now disappear. She wasn't alone. Palace history was filled with names that vanished the moment they gave birth. Women who were relocated for rest, for recovery, for reflection, only to be forgotten. Sometimes their children were spared. Sometimes they weren't. It all depended on who feared them most. And the cruelest part? Sometimes the order didn't come from enemies. It came from the very man who once smiled at her across candlelight, the father of her child, the one who whispered promises in the dark. Because a king feared chaos, feared factions, feared what his own blood might provoke if it came from the wrong womb. So he chose silence, chose order, chose to protect the throne, not the woman who bled to strengthen it. In the end, there was no trial, no grave, no name inscribed in stone. She died as she lived, unseen, inconvenient, and easily erased. But some say the palace still remembers, that on quiet nights, a breeze slips through the corridors, carrying the scent of jasmine and salt. That somewhere, a child now grown walks past a locked door, never knowing who once waited behind it. She bore a prince, but to the throne, She was just a crack in the foundation. And cracks are sealed quickly, because this wasn't a marriage. It was an exchange, a sealed scroll, a royal decree, and a strategy disguised in wedding silk. They called it diplomacy, a bond between kingdoms, a gesture of peace. But everyone in the palace knew what she really was, a bargaining chip wrapped in brocade. The decision was made long before she heard the news, negotiated by men who never met her, signed with hands that would never have to live the consequences. She was chosen not for her charm or her mind, but for her bloodline, pure enough, distant enough, useful enough. They dressed her like a goddess, gifted her jewels, rehearsed her smiles, reminded her of the honor she was carrying. She kept her head down and her mouth closed, like all well-behaved offerings do. And then she left. The palace she grew up in, gone. The mother who raised her, silenced with coin. The language of her childhood, traded for foreign phrases drilled into her under torchlight. Her wedding was grand, lavish, performed for the world. But no one clapped for love. They clapped for stability, for strategy, for a map that now bore fewer borders and more shared suns. At her new home, she smiled. She bowed. She played her part. But she was watched, always. Because if her homeland broke its word, she would be the first to pay. Not a soldier, not a prince. Her. A hostage in a crown. She could not write letters, could not speak her native tongue in public, could not ask when she'd be allowed to visit home, because everyone knew the answer. Never. Even her womb was political. If she bore a child, the child would belong to the foreign court. If she didn't, it would be seen as resistance, rebellion, betrayal. And betrayal, in places like this, was punishable by silence, or worse. Some nights, she heard the court whisper, "She's too quiet." She still prays to her old gods. She might be sending signals, but she had no one to signal. The only thing she carried was a name no one used anymore, a face that reminded everyone of another throne, and a body that guaranteed peace or revenge. And if war ever returned, if diplomacy cracked, if kings turned from friends to enemies again, she wouldn't be spared. She'd be the first reminder, the first retaliation, the first death made public. Because in the end, she wasn't a bride. She was proof, a living treaty, a body shaped to fit into the cracks between empires. And like all treaties, she only mattered until someone broke the deal. She had no title of her own, no army, no ambitions to sit on the throne. All she had was a single thread of connection. She once shared a smile with a prince. And that was enough. In a court where power clung to bloodlines and ambition bloomed like rot beneath polished stone, even the smallest link could be twisted into a weapon. At first, it was just gossip. They said she had influence, that the prince spent too much time in her chamber, that she whispered strategies into his ear, softened his heart, clouded his judgment. She thought it was nonsense. She poured tea, kept her eyes down, never raised her voice. But in a palace built on paranoia, silence could be just as damning as confession. Then came the rebellion. The banners rose before she understood what they meant. The prince made a claim. Ministers switched sides. The court split like a cracked mask, and somehow her name slid beneath the fracture line. She must have encouraged him. She has foreign ties. She was planted to poison the bloodline. It didn't matter that she hadn't seen him in weeks, that she hadn't written a single letter, hadn't made a single demand. The accusation had momentum now, and momentum didn't stop to check facts. She was called the cause, the spark, the manipulative temptress behind the throne, because no one wanted to believe a prince could be ambitious on his own. It was easier to blame a woman, especially one without allies, one who couldn't fight back, one whose beauty could be rewritten as bewitchment. They stripped her chambers first, then her guards, then her voice in the halls. The prince? He vanished into the storm of war. She never saw him again. Perhaps he fled, perhaps he fell, perhaps he sent someone to find her, and they never arrived in time. In the end, her fate was sealed not by what she did, but by what others needed her to be. A distraction, a scapegoat, a message. She was paraded through the court as proof of corruption, not tortured, not beheaded. That would have drawn sympathy. No, Her sentence was cleaner: exile under disgrace. Her name removed from all records, her face painted over in court scrolls. Some say she died in a mountain village. Others say she joined a convent and never spoke again. A few whisper she lives still, nameless, silent, watching from a distance as new names rise and fall. But all agree on one thing: she wasn't the player. She wasn't the prize. She was the piece they sacrificed to justify every move. Because in the Game of Thrones, a woman doesn't have to fight to be destroyed. She just has to be useful. To the wrong man, at the wrong moment, but not the king. He was divine, untouchable, chosen by heaven. His decisions could not be wrong, only misguided. And if he had lost battles, bankrupted provinces, or shattered alliances, it must have been someone else's doing. Someone close. Someone whispering in the dark. Someone soft and silent and perfectly disposable. She was already beside him, already known, already unpopular with the ones who wrote history. She became the answer to every question no one dared ask out loud. Why had the northern generals been dismissed? Why had taxes crushed the grain farmers? Why had the crown lost its grip on foreign courts? Simple. They said she had his ear, that she charmed him into weakness, that her beauty clouded his reason and her ambition poisoned his judgment. She was the woman behind the throne, and in that court there was no greater accusation. No one mentioned she had no access to military records, that she never sat in meetings, that most days she spoke only when spoken to. The facts were irrelevant. The illusion was more powerful. The ministers fed the whispers, the nobles fueled the fire, and the people, hungry, angry, betrayed, seized on the name they were given. It was easier to damn a woman than to question a god-king. And the king? He said nothing. He didn't defend her, not in the council, not in public, not even in private. Perhaps he believed it. Perhaps he didn't care. Or perhaps he simply found comfort in watching someone else carry his guilt. She became the villain in songs, the serpent in paintings, a cautionary tale told to daughters: never rise too close to power. You'll be the one they burn when the gods grow silent. They stripped her of titles, stopped her carriage mid-route, froze her accounts. But they didn't kill her. That would have made her a martyr. Instead, they erased her. She was moved to a smaller palace, fewer servants, no visitors. Her name was no longer spoken at court. If someone mentioned her, they'd say, she used to be someone. Sometimes she looked at her reflection and wondered if she had in fact done something wrong, just by being there, just by being visible. But deep down, she knew. She didn't guide the king. She didn't ruin the kingdom. She was simply the most convenient shape to give failure a face. Because in the end, kings don't fall. They deflect. And she had always stood close enough to be the first place his shadow landed when the sun turned against him. She didn't sit in war councils. She didn't pass secret notes behind fans. She didn't bribe ministers or poison tea. All she did was survive, quietly, obediently, in the space given to her. But in the court, survival itself was suspicious. Because when men moved pieces on the chessboard of power, someone had to bleed to prove their strategy worked. And a woman with no allies, no family, and no voice was the easiest sacrifice. It began, as it often did, with whispers. She was seen speaking with the treasurer last week. She's been receiving gifts. Someone is funding her. She left her chambers late at night. Why? The questions didn't seek answers. They seeded doubt. Enough to justify surveillance. Enough to lay groundwork. Enough to hang guilt on her shoulders when someone else's plan went wrong. And someone's plan always did. A failed coup. A betrayal in the outer provinces. A secret letter intercepted. A noble poisoned. Panic flooded the court, and everyone scrambled to find someone else to blame. She was already halfway buried. No one came to her defense. The prince who once loved her stayed silent. The maid she trusted vanished. The eunuch who served her now avoided her gaze. Even her steps sounded louder, as if the walls themselves no longer wanted to hide her. When the accusations came, they were vague but lethal. Suspicion of collusion, failure to report treasonous speech, presence during unauthorized meetings. She hadn't done any of it, But it didn't matter. In the imperial court, perception was policy, and innocence was a luxury afforded only to the powerful. She was dragged into the center of a scheme she couldn't name, her life tangled in the ambitions of men who'd never spoken her name until they needed someone to disappear. There was no trial, no full sentence read, just a document stamped in red and a verdict delivered before dawn. Some said she was exiled to a mountain shrine, others claimed she was poisoned, her body burned before questions could be asked. One version insists she took the fall for another woman, a higher-ranking consort with more friends and better lies. But all versions end the same. She paid the price. They kept their power. Her name became a footnote in a record of crimes she didn't commit, a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when you stand too close to the fire, even if you never lit the match. She didn't plot. She didn't betray. She just stood in the wrong hallway, when history came looking for someone to punish, not as a question, not as an investigation, but as a verdict dressed in silk. They said she lay with her brother. They said she bewitched the king through forbidden rites. They said her blood carried betrayal, that her skin smelled of conspiracy. And just like that, she wasn't a woman anymore. She was a symbol of corruption, a case to be erased, a curse to be undone. The charges were absurd, but they were useful. Because nothing turned a court faster than a scandal. Nothing unified enemies better than shared disgust. And nothing, absolutely nothing, distracted the people like a woman accused of sins too dark to describe in front of children. She didn't get to speak. By the time she was called, the scrolls had already been written, witnesses coached, evidence forged, a discarded robe here, a poisoned trinket there. One servant claimed to have heard sounds. Another described a strange smell from her chambers. One trembling girl even insisted she saw her walk backwards under the moon, a sure sign of black magic. No one asked why her accusers had debts, or who paid them, or why the testimonies sounded too rehearsed to be real. In truth, no one cared, because the goal was never justice. It was elimination. And what better way to erase a woman than to soil her first? They stripped her titles. They burned her letters. They paraded her name through the streets as a warning. She was locked away, not for what she did, but for what others needed her to become, a monster. And in a cruel twist of irony, her silence was used as proof of guilt. If she were innocent, they said, she would scream. If she had nothing to hide, why does she cry in the dark? But how do you defend yourself when every word you speak becomes more rope around your neck? Some whispered that the charges came from another woman, a rival consort whose influence was waning. Others pointed to the king himself, eager to cleanse his mistakes by projecting them onto her. One rumor claimed the high priest had dreamed of her in fire and snakes, and that was enough. The sentence was exile. The punishment was shame. The real cost was that no one remembered who she actually was. Only what they made her into. Not a mother, not a lover, not a name. Just a warning carved into palace walls. Beware the woman who rises too far. She will fall in flames, whether she lit the fire or not. In the harem, battles were fought with silence, with smiles that didn't reach the eyes, with footsteps too soft to hear. Steel was rarely drawn, but poison brewed in every corner. And for a favored concubine, the most dangerous weapon wasn't the emperor's enemies. It was the empress's patience. At first, the gestures were subtle, a visit from a servant she hadn't seen before, a gift of sweet rice cakes from the inner palace, a beautifully folded note with no sender. Then came the offerings, ginseng tea to strengthen her womb, perfumed oil to soften her skin, herbal wine to help her sleep, kindnesses, they called them. But kindness in the imperial harem was often the first step toward burial. She began waking with headaches, strange dreams, a cough that wouldn't leave. Her hair thinned, her skin paled, yet all her food tasted sweet, all her clothes smelled of jasmine. Something was wrong, but proving it was impossible. Because the empress was too clever to leave fingerprints. The poison didn't kill, it weakened, slowly, politely, enough to make her forget names, stumble in the corridor, cry without reason. Servants murmured that she was losing favor, that perhaps she was cursed, that the emperor had grown tired of her because something about her felt off. And that was the true brilliance. She wouldn't die dramatically. She'd fade, and no one would mourn what disappeared slowly. But not all were so slow. Some died after a single meal, collapsed mid-sentence, foamed at the mouth as palace maids screamed. Rumours would say sickness or divine punishment. No one dared say. The stew was too warm. The honey was too sweet. Bua fep, charms, talismans, whispers under the moon were the other currency of death. Pins placed under pillows, dolls buried beneath garden stones, threads tied around doors to trap wandering souls. In a place where belief held power, fear was as lethal as any tincture. Some concubines went mad, not from poison, but from paranoia, from the not knowing, from the sense that every bowl, every glance, every breeze carried intent. And the empress? She never raised her voice, never made a threat. She just smiled, as all things fell quiet. Because in the inner court, a woman didn't need a blade to win. She needed time, and the certainty that no one would ever blame her for the girl who no longer smiled at sunrise. In the end, the cup of tea didn't need to be poisoned. It just needed to come from the wrong hand. They didn't need to kill her. They just needed her gone, without a body to bury. Death was dramatic, dangerous even. A corpse invited questions. Martyrs inspired songs. But silence could be permanent. She had seen something, heard something, or perhaps she simply knew too much. In a court full of shadows, knowledge was risk, memory was threat, and so they decided, not execution, elimination by other means. They came at night. They always did. Swift, wordless, righteous. She was dragged from her bed. No charges read. No trial promised. Just the cold press of authority against skin that had once been touched with reverence. When she woke, she couldn't see. Later, when the screaming stopped, she found her mouth sealed with pain, the taste of blood, the echo of something missing, her tongue cut, her eyes gone. Her world reduced to silence and blackness. No one visited. The physicians said it was illness, a sudden fever. The court called it divine punishment, a moral reckoning. She spoke too freely, someone whispered. She saw what she shouldn't have. Everyone nodded. The message was clear. This is what happens to women who remember. She wasn't the first. Others had lost voices for speaking truths, fingers snapped for touching sealed scrolls, eyes taken for glancing too long at forbidden corridors. The palace had ways of hiding its secrets, behind mutilation, behind walls, behind silence. They sent her to a secluded residence far from the capital, a soft name for a soft prison. Her days passed in stillness. Her meals arrived without sound. No one ever used her name again. She couldn't write, couldn't cry for help, couldn't even weep in a way others could understand. And the worst part? She still remembered. She remembered the secrets they wanted to bury, the faces that ordered her punished, the soft words spoken in the dark, promises, threats, confessions, all of it still alive in her. But no one feared what she remembered, only what she might repeat, so they made sure she never would. Some say her sentence was merciful, that she was spared death, that at least she still breathed. But breath without voice, without sight, without purpose, was not life. It was exile from the self. She had been a lover, a mother, a witness. Now, she was nothing but a caution, a body in a locked garden, a ghost fed twice a day, a monument to fear wrapped in silk. They didn't kill her. They didn't need to. They made sure no one would ever hear her again. And in a palace like that, silence wasn't peace. It was proof of power, but for her, it was a slow burial, a prison with no chains, no guards, and no way out. The women's cloister sat at the far end of the palace grounds, not hidden, but avoided, a complex of modest rooms and overgrown courtyards, wrapped in the kind of silence that wasn't holy, just final. She was sent there with no trial, no accusations, only a decree delivered in soft tones, for the sake of balance, for the harmony of the court. She was not exiled, not officially punished, but she was no longer allowed to attend ceremonies, to receive letters, to speak to anyone beyond the cloister walls. She packed in silence, One trunk, one maid, no questions asked. Everyone pretended it was voluntary. That's how it always began. The women inside were not criminals. They were former consorts, downgraded favorites, widows of disgraced ministers, sisters of executed generals. All had been too close to power, and then, too inconvenient. They didn't cry. They didn't protest. They walked the stone paths in slow circles, like ghosts rehearsing their afterlife. She was given a room, clean, simple, empty. A schedule. Wake at dawn, offer incense, eat in silence, read nothing, write nothing, speak only if spoken to. She was allowed to walk the gardens, but never beyond the inner gate. She could see the palace rooftops, but not the people who lived beneath them. She could hear the bells ring for festivals, but never attend them again. Time softened everything. Her voice, her memory, even her anger. Seasons passed. New concubines replaced old ones. New scandals replaced hers. Eventually, even her name faded from whispers. When the younger servants asked who she was, the older ones just said, "She was someone, once." And still, she lived. Not free, not imprisoned, just suspended. A life in parentheses, a breath held for decades. There was no escape, because the cloister had no locks. If she left, she would shame the emperor. She would break the peace. She would risk being erased more violently. So she stayed. Some days she knelt in the garden and watched the wind move the bamboo leaves. She wondered if anyone remembered her favorite song, if her family still spoke her name. If the emperor, the one who once called her his moonlight, ever thought of the woman he had placed in a temple of silence. She would never know. That was the true punishment. Not death, not torture, but being alive in a world that had already buried her in thought. The cloister didn't kill. It just waited, until even the sound of her footsteps stopped echoing, and no one noticed she was gone. In a palace built on performance, she mastered the art of presence. She knew when to be silent, when to speak, and when to let others think they held the power. Her beauty turned heads, but it was her intelligence that made them pause. She watched others rise too quickly and fall even faster. The loud ones, the naive ones, the ones who believed the emperor's affection was armor. She learned from them all, then did the opposite. She never flaunted favor. She never outshone the empress. She gave just enough warmth to stay desired, but never enough to be blamed. She played her role like a ghost dressed in silk, visible only when it benefited her. And it worked. She lasted longer than anyone expected, longer than most remembered. Through coups, droughts, royal funerals, and new reigns, she stayed. She wasn't beloved, but she was respected, useful, predictable, controlled. But time is a predator that beauty cannot outrun, and cleverness only works while others aren't watching too closely. Whispers began, as they always did. She knows too much. She's been in the palace too long. She's seen too many kings. New faces arrived, brighter, bolder, younger. The court shifted again, and she found herself standing still, no longer a jewel, now a shadow with a memory too sharp to ignore. Her downfall wasn't loud. It came slowly. An invitation lost. A maid reassigned. A message never returned. She was moved to a quieter wing, fewer attendants, colder halls. Her name faded from the lists. Her presence became a formality, not a necessity. No one accused her. No scandal erupted. She simply expired in relevance. And that was the cruelty. Not that she failed, but that she succeeded too long. Long enough to know what she was being denied. Long enough to remember when she mattered. Some say she requested retirement. Others say she was relocated to a smaller estate. One version says she died peacefully in her sleep, alone, with her hair still pinned the way he once liked. But all versions end the same. She was brilliant. She was careful. She was doomed. Because the palace was never designed to let a woman win, only to let her linger, long enough to believe she might. And in the end, it was not her rivals who destroyed her. It was time, and a system that always needed new faces, but never forgave the ones who learned how to survive. She wasn't defeated. She was outlived. And in the records, She's barely a footnote, just a name once spoken between two kings, now swallowed by the silence she spent a lifetime learning how to navigate. A quiet beauty, clever enough to listen but not speak out of turn, soft enough to be ignored, poised enough to be remembered. That made her perfect, not for love, not for courtly life, but for use. When the empire grew nervous, when alliances cracked and enemies whispered at the border, the palace turned inward. It looked for women like her, women who could slip through court receptions unseen, who could coax secrets from visiting lords without appearing to ask, who could be sent away and never missed, or better yet, never traced. They trained her quietly, not with weapons, but with posture, silence, and timing. She learned how to read glances, to plant doubts, to charm without promise. She wasn't taught to kill, she was taught to observe, to gather words, moods, questions, then disappear before anyone noticed the conversation was too smooth. She played her role well. She slipped into banquets, into caravans, into embassies, always with a purpose. Sometimes as a consort, sometimes as a servant, sometimes as a noblewoman from a fabricated province. Her face changed with makeup, her name changed with each assignment. Her loyalties, however, never belonged to her. She wasn't allowed to choose who she served, only to serve until she broke or vanished. And vanish, they often did. Some were caught and executed in foreign courts. Others were sold out by their own side when the game grew too dangerous. The palace kept no records. If they succeeded, credit went elsewhere. If they failed, their names were buried under a vague phrase, "Service concluded." She lasted longer than most, slipped through more gates, learned more than she should have. At times, she forgot who she was pretending to be. At times, she forgot if she had ever stopped pretending. Then came the last assignment. A high-ranking enemy general, a meeting that wasn't supposed to happen, a message she wasn't meant to carry back. She didn't return. Some say she died on the road. Her body burned without a name. Others say she defected, found freedom in the lies she once wove. A few believe she completed the mission too well, and was silenced by her own court before she could speak. But none of it mattered, not to the palace, because she had become what they needed. A tool, a rumor, a ghost that served until it didn't. She started as a girl in silk. She ended as a whisper between two borders. And no one wept for her, because in their eyes, she was never real, just a shadow designed to vanish on command. And in a palace built on secrets, no fate was more convenient. They were never meant to be remembered. Not in books, not in portraits, not in the carefully edited scrolls that glorified kings and erased the shadows they stood on. These women, concubines, consorts, informants, scapegoats, were stitched into the fabric of empires, only to be cut out when their threads pulled too tight. Some were clever, some were kind, some were silent, others defiant, but none were truly safe. Because in a world where their worth began and ended with usefulness, survival was never freedom, only a longer sentence. They birthed heirs they could not raise. They were sacrificed to avoid scandal. They were praised in one season and poisoned the next. They were weapons in diplomacy, tools in war, and mirrors for men's failures. And when they broke, whether by force, exile, or exhaustion, their names were replaced, their faces blurred, and their stories folded into silence. This was not tragedy in the poetic sense. It was policy. The palace didn't need them to last. It needed them to disappear quietly. But tonight, we've said their names. We've walked their halls, traced the outlines of their lives, however faint history tried to make them. And perhaps that is the smallest act of rebellion, to remember those the world tried to forget. To say, you were here, and you mattered, even if they never let you believe it. In most of human history, the idea of a bedroom, a private, enclosed space dedicated solely to rest, was either impractical, unknown, or laughably luxurious. Especially for the poor, and even for many of the working class or rural families, a room specifically for sleep was not only uncommon, it was virtually non-existent. If you're imagining a medieval family settling into separate rooms at night, doors creaking shut as each person retreats to their own comfortable bed, you'll need to adjust that image. Back then, people slept where they could, when they could, and with whomever happened to be nearby. Having a roof was already a comfort. Having a mattress was practically aristocratic. In many small homes, often no more than a single room made of wood, mud, or thatch, space was used for everything: eating, working, storing tools, cooking, nursing animals, and yes, sleeping. At night, bodies would simply arrange themselves on available surfaces: straw piles, rugs, benches, or bare earth. Some curled near the hearth, others near walls to avoid drafts. There were no designated places. There were only places available. Even in slightly wealthier homes, where multiple rooms might exist, the bedroom wasn't what we think of today. A bed, if there was one, might sit in the main room, a large structure made of wood, draped in heavy cloth, and used by several people. Curtains were drawn not for privacy, but to block out cold. The idea of sleeping alone was neither common nor particularly desirable. The distinction between public and private space didn't really exist in the way modern minds imagine. Life happened communally, sleeping included. Families shared beds. Servants sometimes slept near masters. Apprentices slept in workshops. Travelers slept in barns or kitchens, and most people didn't see this as uncomfortable. It was simply the only way. In urban areas, crowded tenements or boarding houses often crammed people together. Multiple tenants might share a room, or even a bed, by sleeping in shifts. The term hot bedding was used later to describe workers who alternated their sleep. One worker slept in a bed while another was at work, and then they'd switch. It was economical, efficient, hygienic? Not really. For those without homes, beggars, itinerants, travelers, sleeping arrangements were even less formal. The corner of a market stall, the lee side of a barn, or under a bridge would do. In some cities, stone benches or church steps offered slightly raised, solid surfaces. They weren't comfortable, but they were something. Even castles, grand as they were, didn't guarantee privacy. Lords and ladies often slept in chambers where servants might also reside. The presence of others was a practical necessity for safety, heat, and help. A room that could be locked and slept in alone was more symbolic than standard. It's also worth noting that the concept of sleep itself was different. People didn't necessarily go to bed at 10 p.m. and sleep straight through until morning. Historical records suggest many practiced segmented sleep, 2 periods of rest broken by an hour or two of wakefulness in the middle of the night. During that time, they might read, pray, think, or talk quietly. In a single shared space, these rhythms overlapped. So, if your nightly routine involves brushing your teeth, dimming your lamp, adjusting your memory foam pillow, and sinking into a cool, quiet bed in your own sealed-off room, congratulations. You're living a modern fantasy that billions of people in history never even imagined. For most, sleep wasn't a private retreat. It was a function of survival. It wasn't about comfort. It was about endurance. If you were dropped into the Middle Ages, you wouldn't just lose Wi-Fi or running water. You'd lose your room, your bed, your bubble of silence and space. You'd sleep elbow to elbow, draft creeping through the wall, straw poking your back, the scent of soup lingering from dinner, and maybe a mouse or two rustling nearby. That wasn't strange. That was normal. And no one called it a bedroom. They just called it night. In the medieval world, the idea of personal space was almost as fictional as dragons. People lived, worked, ate, and slept in close quarters, not just because they wanted to, but because they had to. Space was limited. Heat was precious. Walls, if they existed, were too thin to separate anyone from anyone else. And when night came, people didn't spread out. They huddled in. Families, large ones, often shared a single room. That room was everything: kitchen, workshop, dining area, bedroom. When it was time to sleep, there was no bedtime routine, no slipping away into separate chambers. Everyone simply settled in, wherever they could, and usually right next to someone else. A typical peasant household might have had 6, 8, or even 10 people under one roof. Parents, children, grandparents, sometimes even farmhands or apprentices, all sleeping in one shared space. There was no such thing as alone time. There were no do not disturb signs. Sleep was a communal activity. Beds, when available, were large, but not luxurious. Often, they were shared by multiple people at once. Parents and children slept together, sometimes with the youngest child wedged between the adults for warmth. Older children might be at the foot of the bed. In winter, dogs or even chickens could be added to the mix. Every bit of warmth mattered. And for the poor, there often wasn't a bed at all. A pile of straw, a worn blanket, or even just cloaks laid out on a packed dirt floor served as a resting place. Everyone used what was there. There was no concept of "this is my corner" or "that's my pillow." Items were shared. So was body heat. So were snores. Privacy wasn't just unavailable. It wasn't expected. If someone turned over in the night, the whole group felt it. If someone mumbled in their sleep, others heard it. If someone was sick, or restless, or had to relieve themselves, everyone around them knew. Sleep was public. Even in wealthier homes, the situation wasn't dramatically different. While aristocrats had more space and, occasionally, separate chambers, it was common for servants or guards to sleep nearby. Beds with curtains offered a little privacy, but mostly to shield from drafts, not from eyes or ears. And in monasteries or barracks, rows of people slept side by side with minimal separation. In many cases, sleeping arrangements were strategic. People chose spots based on warmth, social rank, or safety. The middle of the group was the warmest. Sleeping near the fire was prized in winter. Children often got the warmest spots, not from sentimentality, but practicality. They were more vulnerable to the cold. There was also a matter of security. In villages and small houses, locking up wasn't always possible. Doors were flimsy. Windows might not exist. Having everyone close together meant being able to respond quickly to threats, animals, thieves, or even fires. Sleep wasn't safe. Togetherness was a kind of defense. For travelers, sleeping arrangements were no more private. Inns might cram multiple guests into a single room. Beds could be rented by the space, not the person. A tired merchant might find himself sleeping next to a stranger, back to back, with their bags tucked between them. In churches or barns, people slept shoulder to shoulder. Distance was a luxury no one could afford. For modern minds used to personal bedrooms, closed doors, and sleeping apps, the medieval model is hard to imagine. Today, sharing a bed might be intimate. Back then, it was simply efficient. Romantic notions of candlelit privacy are mostly modern inventions. In the past, you'd be lucky to find a spot where someone's elbow wasn't in your face. And people accepted this, because they had no alternative. Noise, motion, smell, all were part of the nightly experience. If someone snored, they snored. If someone talked in their sleep, no one asked why. If someone had a nightmare, they might wake everyone. But that was life. Tiredness overruled complaint. So next time you crawl into your bed, in your quiet room, under your weighted blanket, remember, for most of history, sleep meant squeezing in. It meant sharing. It meant breathing the same stale air as your siblings, your parents, maybe a goat, and definitely a mouse or two. There were no headphones, no blackout curtains, no alone. There was only night. And whoever happened to be in it with you. If you're fond of firm mattresses, fresh linen, or even just a pillow that smells vaguely like detergent, medieval sleep arrangements might come as a bit of a surprise. Beds, in the modern sense, were rare, and soft, supportive mattresses, they were the stuff of royal fantasy. For most people, the only thing that separated them from the cold, hard earth was a bundle of straw. Not new straw, not clean straw, just straw. Sometimes last year's harvest. Sometimes mixed with dirt, animal hair, or something someone spilled last week. This pile of straw, also called a pallet, was often spread directly onto the floor, sometimes wrapped in a cloth sack, sometimes not. The straw would be reused again and again, night after night. After a few weeks, or months, it would become musty, damp, and slowly begin to rot. But replacing it? That cost time, effort, and another bundle of straw that might be needed for feeding livestock or thatching a roof, so most didn't bother. Lying down on this straw wasn't exactly comfortable. It pricked, it shifted, it flattened in strange places. Over time, the soft crunch of dry stalks gave way to a soggy, compressed mass that smelled a little like wet hay, a little like feet, and a lot like mildew. In cold weather, it stayed cold. In warm weather, it held body heat and attracted pests. Which brings us to the nighttime guests. You see, it wasn't just your family sharing the sleeping space. It was also the local wildlife, small, persistent, and mostly nocturnal. Bedbugs weren't just an inconvenience. They were an inevitability. These tiny, blood-hungry creatures made homes in wooden bed frames, straw pallets, even the cracks between floorboards. Once they settled in, they rarely left. People scratched in their sleep, woke with rashes, developed small red marks they simply accepted as part of life. There were no sprays, no laundromats, no pest control visits. You just coexisted. Rats, too, were frequent visitors, drawn by food scraps, warmth, and the general clutter of medieval homes. Rats made their way into living spaces with alarming regularity. They skittered across floorboards, burrowed into straw piles, and occasionally decided that your feet were the perfect warm hiding spot for a nap. Children learned early not to leave food near the bed, or themselves if they were holding food. In colder regions, some even reported waking up to find a mouse curled inside their blanket, not out of malice, but simply because it was warmer than the wall. Fleas and lice were equally common. They didn't just live in the straw, they lived in people's clothes, in their hair, and in the seams of their woolen cloaks. The body was not a private space. It was a habitat. And yet, people still slept. Because sleep wasn't about luxury. It was a pause between labor. It was how you survived another day of fieldwork, washing, hauling, chopping, nursing, or begging. You didn't wait for peace and quiet. You slept when the fire was low and the room wasn't too noisy. You slept even if someone next to you was coughing, even if your legs itched, even if something small and grey just brushed past your ear. Over time, people adapted. They developed habits to lessen the discomfort, hanging herbs above the sleeping area, changing straw seasonally if they could, dusting ashes on the floor to deter bugs, sleeping with a cat nearby, if one was available, to keep the rat population in check. But still, the straw remained. It poked, it rustled, it absorbed every scent of the room. In wealthier homes, mattresses filled with feathers or wool began to appear. But even then, they weren't protected from bugs. The concept of a clean, hygienic bed, centuries away. So next time you fluff your pillow and settle into your spring-supported cocoon, consider this. For most people in history, comfort was never the goal. Just not waking up with a flea in your nose was already a small victory. And if something scurried past your feet during the night, well, you hoped it wasn't hungry. If you're used to choosing between a memory foam mattress or a firm spring base, this might be difficult to hear. In the Middle Ages, the concept of a dedicated bedroom didn't just not exist. The concept of a bed was already optional. And when it came to where people actually slept, it depended not on comfort or routine, but on opportunity. People slept where they could. That's not a poetic exaggeration. That's a daily reality. For many, especially servants, travellers, apprentices, field hands, and those without land of their own, bedtime didn't mean retreating to a personal space. It meant scanning the area and choosing the least terrible spot to close your eyes for a few hours. Under the kitchen table was a popular choice. Tables in medieval homes were often large, heavy, wooden structures. When meals were done and the day's labour was over, the space beneath offered shade in the summer, shelter in the rain, and a convenient place to be largely ignored. For children, it felt secret. For adults, it was just available. Of course, sleeping under the table came with conditions. There might be crumbs, or rodents sniffing around for them. There might be feet, or a boot that didn't see you. But at least you were on dry ground, mostly. Another common option, under the eaves, outside the house. Beneath the edge of the thatched roof, if there was a bit of overhang, you'd find a narrow stretch of dirt or stone that stayed just a little drier during the rain. People slept there. They folded a cloak, lay it out, and curled up against the wall, not for comfort, but because it was better than the open field. Sometimes, there wasn't even a cloak, just a wall, a roofline, and gravity pressing down from the sky. In farming communities, one of the more popular makeshift sleeping areas was the granary, or any structure where grain was stored. Why? It was dry, it was usually warmer, and most importantly, it was often full of hay, sacks, or loose straw. Not exactly luxurious, but compared to the bare ground, it was downright cozy. Of course, sleeping among food supplies came with company: mice, insects, the occasional weasel, and if someone forgot to tightly close the grain sack, you might wake up to find yourself buried in oats. Or worse, sharing space with something that had been chewing through it all night. Still, many people preferred it. It was sheltered, often quiet, and far from the noise of the central living space. Apprentices, servants, hired labourers, all were familiar with curling up in a storage area and calling it rest. Night watchmen, the guards who kept castles, manors, or village gates safe, also had their own brand of improvised sleeping. Technically, they weren't supposed to sleep at all. But fatigue is persistent, and so, many would rest in brief snatches, propped against stone walls, slumped on benches, or huddled in corners with their cloaks pulled over their heads. It was less about getting comfortable, and more about not falling down. The truth is, medieval life didn't give most people the chance to go to bed. That implies structure, order, comfort. Most people instead just lay down, wherever that happened to be. A barn loft, a shed, a pile of old sacks, even a roadside ditch, if they were far from home. And yet, they managed. Not because it was pleasant, but because it was necessary. Modern readers might find this unimaginable. A life without pillows, without blankets, without walls. The idea of sleeping in a storage room or under a table seems like punishment. But for medieval people, it was normal, practical, expected. What mattered wasn't softness or privacy. What mattered was having a space, however small, where you wouldn't be stepped on, rained on, or woken by something chewing your hair. If you could find that, you slept. And if you couldn't, you sat, leaned, dozed, until the sun came up. Sleep, in those days, wasn't an experience. It was just a break. If you enjoy silence when you sleep, if you need your white noise machine, blackout curtains, and at least a few feet between you and the next breathing human, medieval nights would not have been kind to you. Because in the Middle Ages, sleep was not a private affair. It was, in many ways, a public one. There were no mosquito nets, no curtains, no screens, no walls to block sound or sight, no polite distance. People slept together, literally, physically, socially, in the same room, often on the same surface, and most importantly, with full access to each other's noises, movements, and late-night habits. Imagine this. You finish your day's work, the fire dims, and it's time to rest. You don't go upstairs. There is no upstairs. You don't close a bedroom door. There is no door. You simply lie down, on straw, a bench, a mat, or perhaps just the floor, next to your family, your neighbours, your servants, or your animals. And when you sleep, you do it in full chorus. There are people snoring on your left, someone talking in their sleep on your right, children tossing, old men coughing, someone quietly muttering a prayer in the corner. A dog licks its paw. Someone passes gas, a baby stirs, then cries, then feeds, then cries again. All of this is normal. No one flinches, no one apologizes, because sleep wasn't considered a sacred, silent ritual. It was a necessary pause, one taken collectively. Like eating or praying, sleeping was done with others, around others, in full awareness that you were not alone. The idea of individual sleep hygiene, of controlled light and sound environments, would have seemed laughable. If there was a fire still burning, the flickering light danced across everyone's faces. If there was wind, it howled through the cracks. If someone had lice and scratched all night, you'd hear it, and maybe feel it, because you were likely only a few inches away. There was no such thing as a light sleeper. There were only tired people, and they slept, regardless. In some households, beds were shared not just by necessity but by design. A single large bed might host 2, 3, even 4 people. Guests were welcomed into the bed, Travelers shared space with hosts. Children curled up between adults. There was nothing romantic about it. It was simply how space was used. And in institutional settings, monasteries, boarding houses, poorhouses, sleep was even more communal. Rows of bodies, side by side, on wooden platforms or mats, like sardines in a quiet, restless sea. You didn't whisper. There was no privacy to protect. Even in wealthier homes, while beds might have curtains, those curtains were often for warmth, not secrecy. Servants might still be in the room, guards near the door. In some cases, aristocrats allowed companions to share their bed, not for intimacy, but for status or safety. The atmosphere was not one of peace, but presence. Sleep also didn't always start or end at the same time for everyone. Some people fell asleep early, others stayed up talking. In the middle of the night, someone might get up to tend a fire, relieve themselves, or stir the animals. And because there were no walls, everyone saw it, everyone heard it. Sometimes, they joined in. In a sense, medieval nights were less like private retreats and more like overnight community events. They had their own rhythm, their own sounds, their own strange comfort. To modern minds, it might sound chaotic, exhausting, even unhygienic, but for medieval people, it was simply routine. No one expected solitude. No one demanded silence. Being surrounded by others, even at your most vulnerable, was just part of life. And that might be the hardest part for a modern sleeper to adjust to. Not the straw bed, not the fleas, but the simple fact that you would never truly be alone. Your breath wasn't private. Your dreams weren't hidden. Your night was shared, with voices, with footsteps, with whispers, with wheezing, with snoring, with people, and if you were lucky, you slept through most of it. In modern life, the idea of sleeping next to a goat might sound like a joke, a punchline, maybe a quirky Airbnb experience at best. But in the medieval world, it was simply practical, logical, often necessary, because in the Middle Ages, the cold was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous, and homes didn't come with central heating, insulation, or even thick walls. Winters could be brutal, and firewood wasn't always available or affordable, so people found warmth wherever they could. Sometimes, that meant sleeping next to your animals. In rural homes, it wasn't uncommon for the family's most valuable livestock, cows, goats, sheep, to be brought inside at night, not as pets, not even really as guests, but as living heat sources. Their body warmth, combined with the people sleeping nearby, helped keep the entire household from freezing. The arrangement was simple: people on one side, animals on the other. Sometimes there was a wooden partition, sometimes just a row of stones, sometimes nothing at all. In smaller homes, the humans and animals quite literally shared the same single-room space. You might sleep with your head near the hearth and a cow breathing quietly behind you, or with a sheep curled near your feet, or a chicken pecking around your straw mat, looking for leftovers before settling down on a beam. No one thought this was odd. The cow didn't complain. The family didn't either, because warmth was warmth, and animal breath, thick, slow, and heavy, actually helped raise the temperature of a room by a few precious degrees. In places where the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, that small difference meant everything. Of course, there were downsides. Animals don't exactly sleep quietly. They grunt, they shuffle, they sigh, they chew. Sometimes they relieve themselves. And that smell? It wasn't candlelight and pine. It was reality. Damp hay, manure, wet wool. It filled the house. It clung to your clothes. You got used to it, or at least you pretended to. In fact, many medieval homes were built specifically to accommodate this human-animal cohabitation. Some had raised wooden platforms for sleeping above the animals. The body heat would rise. The stink would too, but priorities were priorities. In mountainous or colder regions, the arrangement was even more deliberate. Farmers might sleep in barns during the winter, rather than risk the chill of a stone cottage. And barn lofts, while drafty, were full of hay, soft, dry, and far less lonely than a freezing, silent bedroom. Children, especially, often slept near the animals, not because it was cute, but because they needed the warmth most. A small child pressed between two adults might still be cold, but tucked in next to a woolly sheep? Much better. Dogs played a special role, not just herders, but heaters. Large working dogs were encouraged to curl up on beds, near feet, even directly on top of blankets. A dog's breath was warmer than a stone wall, and less likely to chew your boot. This kind of sleeping arrangement also had another benefit: security. Animals in the house meant you could hear them if something startled them. A restless cow might sense danger before a person did. A barking dog might alert the family to a thief, a predator, or a fire. Being close meant being safer. So no, you didn't get a good night's sleep, not in the modern sense. You didn't drift off in silence with lavender oil and calming music. You fell asleep to the sound of chewing, the occasional fart, the breath of something large and alive shifting nearby. But you stayed warm. And that was the point. Because when winter wrapped its fingers around the village, and the hearth burned low, and your feet ached from work, you didn't ask for peace and quiet. You asked not to shiver all night. You asked to wake up. So you shared your sleep, with your siblings, with your neighbors, and sometimes with a cow named Bess. If you think a bed has to be soft, wide, and made for sleeping, you're thinking modern. In the medieval world, a bed could mean many things, but one thing it didn't always mean was comfort. In fact, sometimes it didn't even mean a mattress. For a large part of the population, what they slept on was whatever was available, and that often meant something not meant for sleeping at all. A wooden bench, a flat board, a storage chest, a cold stone step. In some cases, people slept sitting up, not by choice, but because there wasn't enough room, or it simply wasn't safe to lie down. Let's start with a bench. Many medieval homes had a long, simple bench that ran along the wall. During the day, it was for sitting, eating, or storing tools. At night, it became a sleeping surface. Flat, hard, wooden, no cushion, no backrest, and yet for some, it was the best option in the house. People would stretch out on it, or try to. Sometimes they curled up sideways, knees bent. Sometimes they shared the bench, with one person's feet near another's head. If they were lucky, they had a blanket. If not, they used their cloak. And if there was no space left on the bench, the floor would have to do. In monasteries and other communal settings, sleep often happened on raised wooden platforms, or even bare floorboards. Monks were known to sleep in their robes, without mattresses, sometimes even without lying fully down. Sleep was a necessity, not a pleasure. For night watchmen, soldiers, or travelers, the idea of lying down flat was often a luxury. They would rest seated, backs against a wall, cloaks pulled tightly, heads nodding forward. Some learned to sleep in a kind of light doze, never fully drifting off, just enough to rest the eyes while still listening. Sleeping upright wasn't just a habit, it was sometimes the rule. Guards on duty couldn't afford to stretch out. Apprentices sleeping in workshops had no space to recline. Travelers sleeping in churches, roadside shelters, or horse carts simply adapted. Even in wealthier homes, not everyone had access to a full bed. Servants often slept on stools, storage trunks, or rolled-up carpets. In colder weather, they might position themselves near the fire, using the hearth's edge as a pillow. Again, not because it was comfortable, but because it was warm. There are even historical accounts of people sleeping in alcoves carved into the walls, small spaces just wide enough to lie in, like wooden coffins built for the living. These were dark, narrow, and drafty, but they offered some privacy, and for many, that was enough. The point is, sleeping wasn't romantic. There were no plush headboards, no layers of pillows, no fresh linens. What we think of as a real bed, something padded, personal, and designed just for sleep, was rare, reserved for the upper class. And even then, it didn't come with a guarantee of rest. Because whether you slept on a bench or a feather-stuffed mattress, you still had to deal with the cold, the noise, the smells, the company, the bugs. And perhaps most of all, the fatigue. Because people worked hard, all day, and by night, they didn't need ideal conditions. They needed somewhere to stop moving, somewhere to close their eyes. A bench was good enough. A folded cloak on a crate was good enough. A stone floor near a dying fire? Still good enough. So next time you toss and turn on your mattress, wondering if it's too firm or too soft, too warm or too cool, remember, for much of history, your ancestors would have been thrilled with just a clean bench, or even a not-so-clean one, as long as it wasn't already taken by someone else, or a cat, or a pile of boots. Today, if you wake up at 2 a.m., it usually feels like something's wrong. Maybe you drank too much coffee. Maybe you're stressed. You check the clock, roll over, and desperately try to fall back asleep, convinced that a full, uninterrupted 8 hours is the gold standard. But in the Middle Ages, waking up in the middle of the night wasn't a problem. It was expected. People didn't sleep in one long stretch. Instead, they slept in two distinct phases, often called first sleep and second sleep. The time in between? A natural, quiet intermission that lasted an hour or more. And yes, they used it to stretch, to think, to stoke the fire, or simply to talk. Here's how it worked. As night fell, earlier than it does now, especially before artificial lighting, people would go to sleep not long after dusk, maybe around 8 or 9 p.m., depending on the season. This was the first sleep. It would last for several hours, deep and heavy. Then, sometime after midnight, they would wake up. Not fully and not anxiously, just wake, naturally, as if the body knew it needed a break before continuing. What did they do with that time? Surprisingly, a lot. Some people prayed. Devotion was a central part of medieval life, and the quiet of night was seen as a perfect time for reflection. Religious texts even recommended midnight prayer, not as a chore, but as a peaceful, contemplative pause between sleeps. Others took care of small chores. They mended clothing, checked on animals, tended to the fire, stirred the soup pot. A few might even read or write, if they were literate and had access to candles or firelight. But many simply talked. Families lying together in the dark would whisper. Spouses might share thoughts, gossip, or quiet jokes. Friends on a journey might whisper stories to pass the time. In some recorded cases, neighbors visited each other during this time, a brief, torch-lit social hour in the middle of the night. It was a kind of bonus time, not day, not sleep, a small island of stillness between labor and more labor. For couples, it was sometimes a moment of intimacy. Historical records, including court documents and medical manuals, mention that this window between first and second sleep was considered one of the best times for conception. The body had rested, the mind was calm, and there were fewer distractions. But even without romance, the midnight hour was oddly social. People didn't panic about being awake. They didn't count how many hours of sleep they were getting. No one had a Fitbit reminding them they'd failed. Waking up was normal, peaceful, often even pleasant. After this interlude, people would drift back into their second sleep, which carried them through the remaining hours of night until morning. This segmented sleep pattern wasn't a medieval glitch. It appears to have been the norm for centuries, across cultures, regions, and classes. It only faded with the arrival of artificial lighting, industrial schedules, and the modern obsession with sleep as performance. Today, the very idea seems strange. Why would anyone break up their night like that? Isn't 8 straight hours better? Well, not necessarily. Modern sleep studies have even suggested that split sleep can align with the body's natural circadian rhythms. That waking up in the night isn't unnatural. It's just inconvenient in a society ruled by clocks and calendars. But in medieval times, there were no alarms, no emails waiting, no anxiety about being productive. If you woke up, you used the time however you liked, or you didn't. And then, eventually, you went back to sleep. Imagine lying on a pile of straw, under a thick wool blanket, a dog snoring softly nearby, your neighbor's foot pressing into your side, and hearing someone murmur, "Are you awake too?" And just like that, a conversation begins, in whispers, somewhere between dreams and dawn. Today, sleep is often treated as a luxury. We talk about bedtime routines, ideal mattress firmness, melatonin gummies, and sleep hygiene. We track our REM cycles and brag about getting a full 8 hours. We light candles. We put our phones on Do Not Disturb. We sleep to feel good. In the Middle Ages, people slept to make it through the next day. That's it. Sleep wasn't romantic. It wasn't restorative in the way we talk about it now. It was survival. Plain and simple. You worked until your body couldn't go anymore, and then you collapsed onto whatever surface was available. A bench, a corner of the floor, a pile of straw next to the pig. You didn't tuck yourself in. You didn't fluff a pillow. You didn't sip chamomile tea. You lay down, and you shut your eyes. The exhaustion wasn't mental. It was physical. You'd been in the fields since sunrise, or hauling firewood, or walking miles in rough shoes, or standing for hours over a boiling pot. Sleep wasn't a reward for your productivity. It was your only chance at not collapsing tomorrow. And yet, that sleep was rarely peaceful. The floor was cold. The straw was damp. There was always someone nearby, snoring, coughing, shifting, muttering in their dreams. If you were lucky, you had a blanket. If you were really lucky, no fleas that night. But luck wasn't something most people counted on. Outside, animals stirred. Inside, babies cried. Your back hurt. Your legs cramped. The fire needed tending. The roof dripped. And the air was filled with the stale scent of people, sweat, and yesterday's stew. Still, you slept. Because what other choice was there? Even dreaming wasn't guaranteed. Chronic fatigue dulled the edges of imagination. People went to sleep, not to escape, but to pause, to be still, for just a few hours. You didn't wake up refreshed. You woke up because you had to. Morning didn't begin gently. There were no alarms, just roosters, footsteps, or the sound of someone banging pots. You got up, stiff and sore, put on yesterday's clothes, and started again. Your body didn't fully recover. It just kept going. Rest wasn't a right. It was a brief interruption in the long, repetitive rhythm of work. For many, sleep even felt like lost time, hours that could have been spent doing something useful. In fact, some medieval thinkers warned against sleeping too much, fearing it led to laziness or sin. Waking early was seen as virtuous. Resting too long? Suspicious. It's no wonder, then, that so much medieval sleep was short, broken, and shared. People grabbed it when and where they could, during prayer, on carts, near the fire, or leaning against a wall. They learned to nap in moments, to rest their eyes while stirring a pot, to nod off during sermons. The line between sleep and wakefulness was blurry, and sleep wasn't something you prepared for. It was something you fell into. The idea that sleep should be peaceful, private, and silent would have felt foreign. What mattered wasn't how well you slept. It was that you could keep working afterward. So the next time you complain that your mattress is too soft, or that your blackout curtains don't quite cover the window, imagine this instead. You're on a stone floor. There's no pillow. The blanket smells like mold. Your stomach growls. You've worked all day, and you'll work all day again tomorrow. There are 3 other people snoring next to you. One of them is probably your cousin. Another might be your goat. And yet, you close your eyes. Because sleep isn't something to enjoy. It's something to survive. We often think of the past as simpler, quieter, slower. But when it came to sleep in the medieval world, it wasn't easier. It was harder, colder, louder, itchier, more crowded, and far, far less private. There were no bedrooms, no mattresses, no bedtime rituals or essential oils. People didn't tuck themselves into plush duvets or drift off to calming playlists. They slept where they could, when they could, and with whomever, or whatever, happened to be nearby, under tables, beside cows, on damp straw, with fleas, rats, and snores echoing all around. And they did this every night, because they had to. Sleep wasn't a luxury. It was a pause, a reset button, a brief stop between one day of labor and the next. Not a retreat from life, but a continuation of it, just with your eyes closed. In the silence between segmented sleeps, people prayed, talked, shifted position, added more wood to the fire. They didn't ask for silence or solitude. They asked not to freeze. There was no concept of sleep quality. There was only exhaustion and the hope of rest. Today, sleep is something we curate, with apps and routines and ideal environments. But for most of history, people didn't curate sleep. They endured it. And that endurance tells us something humbling. The body can adapt. Even in the worst of conditions, it finds a way to keep going, to shut down, to carry on. Still, it's hard to imagine ourselves in their place. We, who complain when our pillow is too warm. We, who cancel plans because we didn't get 8 hours. We, who buy blackout curtains and white noise machines just to fall asleep. We probably wouldn't last a night in their world. Certainly not a day after it. So tonight, when you lie in bed, clean, quiet, alone, take a moment to appreciate just how soft modern life really is. And then drift off. You've earned it. They never could. If you lived in ancient Greece and someone important died, the funeral wouldn't be quiet. It wouldn't be solemn. It wouldn't be filled with whispered prayers and silent tears. It would be loud, very loud. And if you listened closely, you'd notice something strange. Many of those wailing voices, the ones screaming the name of the deceased, pounding their chests, tearing their clothes, they didn't even know the person who died. They were professionals, paid to cry. Yes, really. In ancient Greece, mourning was a performance, and that performance required experts. Women, usually from lower-class backgrounds, were hired specifically to attend funerals and express grief. Their job wasn't to comfort the family. Their job was to make the family look important. The louder the wailing, the more respected the dead appeared. This profession had many names. Today we might call them mourning women or funeral criers, but in their time they were known for their function, not their title. They were expected to show up, cry convincingly, and disappear. It was not an easy job. To cry on command, in front of dozens or hundreds of people, with full emotional force, takes stamina. To shout someone's name as if you had known them your entire life, when in reality you had never met them, takes skill. Some of these women developed techniques. They cried in rhythm, in harmony with one another, building crescendos of grief that echoed through the streets. Some threw dirt in their hair. Others scratched their faces, or beat their own chests in dramatic fashion. Their job was to turn pain into spectacle. And this wasn't just a quirk of Greek culture. The job came with real payment. These women were paid either in coin, food, or clothing, depending on the wealth of the family. Richer households could afford larger groups, a full choir of grief. Sometimes the mourners would outnumber the actual friends of the deceased. Sometimes they were the only ones crying at all. It may sound strange now, but back then, silence at a funeral could be shameful. If nobody cried, it suggested that the dead had lived a life unworthy of tears. So, the families made sure that wouldn't happen, by outsourcing their sorrow. Hiring mourners wasn't a sign of deception, it was a sign of status. To the Greeks, a loud funeral meant a good life, a legacy worth grieving. And, like any social custom, it became competitive. Some families went overboard, hiring as many wailing women as they could afford. It was a kind of ancient PR campaign. See how beloved our father was, see how loudly they cry. The result was a funeral that sounded less like mourning and more like a tragic opera. Of course, not everyone approved. Some philosophers thought the whole thing was absurd. They argued that true grief is silent, that pain can't be performed. But others disagreed. They saw public mourning as an essential part of healing. It was theatre, yes, but theatre with meaning. The irony is that these women, who were paid to show emotion, often had very little freedom to express their own. Many came from classes that were otherwise silenced in public life. In the household, in the courts, even in daily conversation, women were expected to be quiet. But at funerals, they were the loudest voices in the room. It was one of the only times society allowed, even encouraged, women to take up space, to make noise, to command attention, and they did. Not for themselves, but for the dead. In some cases, girls were trained from a young age to enter this profession. Mothers would pass on techniques, how to sob convincingly, how to fake shortness of breath, how to time their cries with the pauses in a funeral speech. Some even developed signatures, a kind of emotional style. Families would ask for them by name. She was the one who cried at my uncle's funeral. She was excellent. Of course, not all mourners were equally skilled. The best ones were in high demand, And the worst? Well, a bad performance could cause embarrassment, even mockery. Imagine hiring someone to weep for your father, only to have her laugh mid-cry or yawn between sobs. That wouldn't do. So, yes, this was a real job. It had its own economy, its own standards, and its own expectations. A woman could make a living, or at least a little extra income, by being professionally sad. And in a world where women had so few public roles, perhaps that sadness was also a strange kind of power. It may seem odd now, even uncomfortable, that people in the ancient world would hire strangers to cry at a funeral. After all, isn't grief supposed to be personal? Isn't it something that comes from love, from loss, from memory? But in ancient Greece, grief was never just personal. It was public, it was ceremonial, and most of all, it was expected. To understand why hired mourners existed, you first have to understand what a funeral meant in ancient Greek society. It was not just a farewell. It was not just a ritual. It was a performance of legacy. For the ancient Greeks, a funeral was a social event, one that displayed the status of the deceased and the reputation of the family. It was a moment when private loss became public theatre, and in this theatre, silence was not golden. It was shameful. A quiet funeral might suggest that the person who died had not mattered much, that they had lived an unremarkable life, that they would not be missed. And in a society where honour was everything, that simply wouldn't do. Families needed to ensure that their loved one appeared deeply mourned, regardless of how many people actually cared. And so, they brought in reinforcements. Women who knew how to cry, how to wail, how to break hearts, even if it wasn't their own heart that was broken. These women added volume. They added presence. They added legitimacy. Because in the ancient mindset, grief was measured by sound. The louder the crying, the deeper the sorrow. The more chaotic the mourning, the more loved the deceased must have been. Funerals were public declarations of value, and crying was proof of that value. Hiring mourners was also practical. Real grief, as we know, is often quiet. Families are in shock. Friends are too sad to speak. Many loved ones can barely keep standing, let alone scream at the top of their lungs. So the hired mourners filled that gap. They gave grief a voice when those who truly grieved had none. There was also competition. In Greek city-states, families vied for prestige. Everything was a show. The home, the feast, the marriage, and yes, even the funeral. One family's loss became another family's comparison. Who had more mourners? Who had more drama? Who had the louder funeral? If your neighbour hired 10 criers, you might consider hiring 15. If they beat their chests, you'd instruct yours to tear their robes. And so, a kind of emotional arms race began. But the need for mourners wasn't just about ego. It was also deeply rooted in religious and cultural beliefs. The Greeks believed that the soul needed help moving on from the world of the living to the world of the dead. Loud public mourning was part of that transition. It signaled to the spirit that it was truly gone, truly missed, and truly honoured. Without that public expression, some believed the soul might linger, restless, uncertain, caught between worlds. So the crying wasn't only for the living, it was for the dead. And in many ways, it was also for the gods. Showing proper mourning was an act of piety. Failing to do so could invite divine disapproval. You didn't want to seem cold, or careless, or disrespectful to fate. Hiring mourners ensured that the family was visibly, audibly devout. Of course, not everyone agreed with this system. Some philosophers, especially the Stoics, argued that real grief didn't need noise. They believed that mourning should be inward, restrained, thoughtful. But even they recognized that society often demanded something else entirely. Emotion wasn't just a feeling, it was a duty. And for women in particular, mourning was one of the few public roles they were allowed to play. In Greek society, women had little say in politics, economics, or law. But at funerals they were given the stage. They were allowed, even encouraged, to raise their voices, to perform their sorrow, to lead the ceremony of loss. It was one of the only times they were heard. So they learned how to cry well. and others paid them to do it. Over time, what began as genuine sorrow became tradition. What began as expression became expectation, and what began as a personal ritual became a public display. So, why did they need to hire people to cry? Because funerals were not about what you felt. They were about what you showed. And in ancient Greece, grief wasn't something you kept to yourself. It was something you put on stage. In ancient Greece, women were often silent. They were kept indoors, kept modest, kept apart from the forums, the politics, the public squares. But at funerals, they were allowed to speak. And not just speak, they were expected to cry, to wail, to mourn out loud. Funerals were one of the few social spaces where female emotion wasn't just accepted, it was required. This wasn't by accident, it was tradition. And in that tradition, emotion became a kind of performance, one that only women were allowed or obligated to give. In daily life, a Greek woman's role was domestic. She oversaw the household, raised children, tended to the loom. She didn't vote. She didn't debate in the agora. In fact, even being seen too much in public could bring shame to her family. But mourning was different. Grief, unlike politics, was considered natural to women. Emotional expression was viewed as feminine. And so, society gave women ownership over sorrow. That ownership came with both privilege and burden. It meant that only women could truly mourn in public. Men were expected to grieve in silence, stoic, restrained, dignified. But women? They were the ones who cried, screamed, collapsed, and begged the dead to return. They tore their garments. They scratched their cheeks. They shook dust into their hair. And when the family needed louder grief, when they needed a show of sorrow, they didn't turn to men, they turned to women. Because emotion was their role. It was their duty. It was their skill. In this way, female emotion became a form of cultural capital. It wasn't just feeling, it was function. Young girls were often trained to mourn in specific ways. There were techniques: when to raise the pitch of the voice, how to stagger the breath between sobs, where to stand in relation to the body of the deceased. There were even patterns, call and response chants between groups of mourning women, a kind of funeral chorus echoing through the streets. It was not just grief, it was choreography. Many of these mourning performances followed ritual rhythms. Crying had a pace, wailing had a beat. Each cry built on the one before it, rising and falling like waves. The collective voices of women, crying in sync, created a haunting sound, part sadness, part ceremony. And yet, while they performed grief, many of these women were not grieving their own loss. They were grieving on behalf of someone else. That's what made it valuable. Because the mourning woman was not just a daughter or sister, she was a vessel, a public symbol of sorrow, a channel through which the family's loss could be seen and heard by the entire community. And though many of these women had little power in daily life, at a funeral, they became essential. For a moment, they weren't silent. They weren't invisible. They were central to the ritual. They stood at the front. They led the procession. They voiced the pain. And in some cases, they were paid for it. This strange intersection between emotion, gender, and economics gave women a unique place in the social fabric. Their tears became a kind of currency, exchanged for reputation, respect, or coin. It's important to remember that this was not always liberating. Many women had no choice. If they were part of the household, they were expected to mourn, loudly, publicly, and in accordance with social rules. If they were hired, their sorrow had to be convincing, but not excessive, authentic, but still controlled. Too little emotion, and they failed the role. Too much, and they risked being punished for disrupting the ritual. So they walked a narrow line. Emotion as expectation. Emotion as labor. Emotion as identity. Some thinkers of the time questioned the practice. Philosophers like Solon even tried to regulate or ban excessive mourning. They worried that emotion could destabilize order, that too much crying could stir unrest or weaken the resolve of the living. But their laws were rarely enforced for long, because society still needed the cry. It needed the image of women gathered at the grave, raising their voices like a choir of loss. It needed the rhythm of grief to echo through the community, reminding everyone of death and the dignity it demanded. So while women were denied the podium, the scroll, and the sword, they were given the stage of mourning, and they owned it. In ancient Greece, to weep was not just to feel, it was to serve, to honor, to embody tradition. And for a brief moment, in a narrow window of sound and sorrow, emotion became power. And that power belonged to women. When we imagine ancient funerals, we often picture raw grief. Tears falling freely, people wailing uncontrollably, a scene of unfiltered sorrow spilling into the streets. But in ancient Greece, grief wasn't always unfiltered. It was, in many cases, carefully constructed. Not false, but refined. Because while emotions were central to mourning, they were also expected to follow form. Grief had shape. Grief had structure. Grief had technique. To the Greeks, a proper funeral wasn't only about expressing loss, it was about performing it in a way that felt right to the community, to the family, and to the gods. And so, mourning became an art. And like any art, it could be practiced, rehearsed, perfected. There were movements, gestures, and rhythms that came to define the mourning process. Women, especially professional mourners, followed a kind of choreography, passed down over generations. One of the most recognizable gestures was the striking of the chest. A woman would pound her fists against her heart, again and again, as if trying to physically release the pain. This movement was dramatic, visible from far away, and immediately communicated deep sorrow. It also made sound, sharp, repetitive, adding to the acoustic weight of the ceremony. Another gesture was tearing the hair. Mourners would grab handfuls of their own hair, pull it down their face or out at the roots, letting strands fall to the ground or into the grave. It was symbolic, a visible sacrifice of beauty and dignity in honor of the dead. There was also the ripping of clothing, not randomly, but deliberately. Garments were torn at the collar or sleeve to show that life itself had been torn. Sometimes, these clothes were stitched in a certain way, to make them easier to rip, so the motion looked natural and effortless, even when it wasn't. The face, too, became part of the performance. Women would scratch their cheeks until they bled, not enough to cause serious harm, but enough to leave a mark. This was not just for show, it was believed to symbolize the breaking of the soul, the internal pain brought to the surface. And then there was the voice. Grief had a sound, a rhythm, a volume. The mourning cry was not chaotic noise, it was measured. Often mourners cried in unison, following a leader. They would call out the name of the deceased in a kind of chant, repeating it 3 times, once for the earth, once for the gods, and once for memory. Sometimes they sang laments, known as threnoi, poems of loss performed aloud. These were passed down orally, crafted with repeating patterns and sorrowful refrains. The best mourners knew how to carry a note, how to tremble their voice just enough to seem overwhelmed, yet never out of control. There were even funerary scripts, not written on paper, but memorized, that dictated what to say, how to say it, and when to say it. Certain lines were meant for when the body was prepared. Others were timed with the procession to the grave. Still others were saved for the moment the earth was poured over the coffin. Nothing was random. Every cry had a cue. Every gesture had meaning. This did not mean the grief was fake. In fact, many women performing these rituals were deeply affected, but the performance was still bound by tradition, and tradition, like any stage, had its marks. For hired mourners, the performance was even more refined. They had reputations to protect. If a mourner was known for her ability to collapse convincingly, or to cry without blinking for minutes on end, she would be requested again and again by wealthier families. Some even became known for specific roles: the soft weeper, the wild wailer, the stoic mother figure. Each had a place, like actors in a play, and families, depending on their taste or social standing, would choose the style that suited their image. Because funerals were not just moments of farewell. They were productions of grief, elaborate, symbolic, powerful. And in those productions, the mourners were the main cast. Over time, these techniques became embedded in Greek mourning culture. Not everyone hired professionals, but even private ceremonies often followed the same patterns: gestures learned by watching, sounds passed down from mother to daughter. So while we might think of mourning as messy and unpredictable, in ancient Greece, it was often neither. It was ritualized sadness. It was disciplined heartbreak. It was grief, choreographed. And in that careful choreography, the Greeks found a way to make sorrow visible, audible, and communal, a shared language of loss, spoken through hands, voice, and tear. In ancient Greece, grief may have been loud, but it wasn't free. You couldn't just cry however you wanted. You couldn't throw yourself to the ground, scream to the heavens, or tear your clothes, unless it was your place to do so. Because even sorrow had social rules. Even mourning was hierarchical. And as strange as it may seem now, in a time when we encourage people to feel their feelings, the Greeks believed that grief, like most things, needed to be controlled, performed, and, most of all, ranked. There were levels to who could express what. At the top were the professional mourners, usually women, hired from outside the household. Their job was to weep as dramatically and visibly as possible. They were expected to perform pain, to fill the space with sound, and to show the world that the dead was deeply missed. Ironically, these women often had no connection to the deceased, but they had permission and even authority to cry louder than the family itself. That's because the family, especially women within the household, had strict limits. A wife, a daughter, even a mother, she was allowed to mourn, of course, but her mourning had to be measured, controlled. Grief was permitted, but not too much. If she collapsed or cried too long, it could be seen as disruptive, even undignified. There was fear that excessive sorrow might bring shame, that it could disturb the gods, or dishonor the memory of the dead. Or worse, it might suggest that the family had lost control. So, while the household women were expected to be visibly sad, they had to stay within bounds. Public crying was sometimes even delegated to outsiders, to preserve the image of the family as calm, composed, and respectable. In this way, mourning became a kind of division of labor. The paid mourners did the loud, messy work. The family stayed quiet, elegant, reserved. And men? Men, especially of high status, were often discouraged from crying at all. They were expected to embody self-control, to lead the funeral procession without trembling, to make speeches without tears. In Greek society, masculinity was tied to reason, not emotion. A weeping man risked looking weak, or even womanly, which could damage his public image. So what happened if someone stepped out of line? If a family member cried too much? If a woman threw herself on the grave when she wasn't supposed to? In some periods of Greek history, there were actual laws against excessive mourning. The Athenian lawgiver Solon, for example, banned certain behaviors at funerals. No cutting of hair, no scratching of the face, no loud lamentation outside the home. These acts were seen as too primitive, reminders of older, more chaotic rituals. People still found ways to mourn, of course, but they did so within structure. And often, they left the big emotions to the professionals. This tiered system reveals something deeper. That mourning wasn't just emotional, it was political. It was tied to class, to gender, to reputation. The rich could afford mourners. The poor had to mourn quietly. Women could express pain, but only if they didn't go too far. Men could hardly express it at all. And yet, beneath all of this structure, real grief still existed. Behind the measured gestures and choreographed cries, there were real hearts breaking. Real people missing loved ones. Real sorrow, wrapped in rules. But in the eyes of ancient Greek society, emotion had to be organized, just like everything else. Because even at a funeral, especially at a funeral, order had to be maintained. For a time, crying was everywhere in ancient Greece. Loud, rhythmic, theatrical grief echoed through the streets during funerals. Women scratched their faces. Mourners tore their robes. The sound of sorrow rolled through cities like thunder. But eventually, it became too much. At least, for the lawmakers. In the 6th century BCE, the Athenian lawgiver Solon looked at these rituals. and saw disorder. He believed that the emotional excess of public mourning threatened the calm and dignity of the city-state. It was too loud, too wild, too unpredictable. So, he decided to put a stop to it. Solon passed a series of funeral reforms designed to regulate grief. These laws were clear. No paid mourning, no loud lamentation in public spaces, no tearing of the face or body, no overly dramatic displays. Funerals, he said, should be private, simple, and controlled. The home, not the street, was the proper place for sorrow. At the heart of Solon's reforms was a belief that emotions, when unrestrained, could destabilize the community. And perhaps he wasn't wrong. Grief has a way of spreading. A single scream can awaken something deep, not just in one family, but in an entire city. And so, the mourning profession was banned, outlawed, erased from official life. But not for long, because while the laws changed, people didn't. Grief didn't get quieter just because the law asked it to. Families still wanted to honor their dead. They still wanted to show respect, sorrow, and significance. And so, they found ways around the rules. The crying didn't stop. It just moved indoors. Rather than mourn in the streets, families held ceremonies inside their homes. Rather than hire obvious professionals, they invited friends, women who just happened to be very good at mourning. Rather than scream in public, they wept behind closed doors, but everyone still heard it. In time, the mourning profession returned. Quietly, discreetly, but unmistakably. Later generations relaxed Solon's rules. While some cities kept stricter guidelines, others allowed more flexibility, especially for wealthy families who could afford to bend tradition. Public mourning re-emerged, especially during large funerals or processions for famous individuals. Hired mourners were welcomed once again, as long as they didn't go too far. The line between acceptable and excessive grief was never fixed. It shifted with time, with politics, with fashion, and so the mourning profession survived, not by defying the law, but by adapting to it. This story, of restriction followed by return, reveals something important about ancient society, that rituals don't disappear easily. Even when banned, they live on in memory, in private practice, in quiet rebellion. Because beneath the surface of every rule is a human need. The need to express pain, the need to be seen, the need to say goodbye, not just silently, but fully, loudly, completely. In the end, Solon's reforms couldn't erase that. And so, the mourners came back. Not with fanfare, not with laws, but with a soft knock on the door and a well-practiced cry. The idea of hiring people to cry at funerals may seem unusual, strange even, but it wasn't just ancient Greece that embraced this practice. It wasn't an isolated custom. Across time, across continents, across languages and beliefs, many cultures developed their own version of professional mourning, because the need to grieve loudly, visibly, and in front of others is a deeply human one. Egypt. In ancient Egypt, mourning was taken very seriously. The funeral of a pharaoh or noble was not just a moment of sadness, it was a cosmic event, a transition from this world to the next. Professional mourners were often hired to wail, scream, and beat their bodies in public rituals. Two women, in particular, were chosen to represent the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, divine sisters who wept for their slain brother, Osiris. These mourners would dress in special robes, stand at either end of the coffin, and cry in ceremonial rhythm, calling the soul into the afterlife. Grief, in Egypt, was not only expression, it was protection. Loud mourning was believed to guide the dead safely into eternity. China. In ancient and even modern Chinese traditions, crying was also formalized. During imperial times, professional mourners were hired for elite funerals, especially when a family feared that too few relatives would show public sorrow. These mourners cried in dramatic waves, telling stories about the deceased as they wept. Some even sang funeral songs, composed specifically for the occasion, blending tears with melody. The louder and longer the mourning, the greater the respect shown to the dead. This tradition continued well into the 20th century, and in some rural areas, still survives today. India. In India, particularly among rural communities and older traditions, mourning women known as Rudali, which literally means female criers, played a central role. The Rudali were often from lower castes. They were hired to express grief that the family, especially the men, could not show publicly. These women wailed with such power and emotion that neighbors would gather just to hear the depth of the cries. Some even developed reputations. If you wanted a truly powerful farewell, you hired the best Rudali available. Like in Greece, grief was not only emotion, it was representation. Vietnam. In traditional Vietnamese culture, especially in the north, professional mourners, often women, were hired to lead the crying at funerals. They would wear white mourning clothes, chant the name of the dead, and guide the family through the rituals of grief. Sometimes, these women were musicians or singers as well, performing ancient tunes called hatvan, spiritual songs that mixed emotion with ceremony. Their presence brought not just sound, but structure to the mourning process. Africa. Among many African cultures, mourning is also a public, communal act, and in several traditions, hired mourners or designated wailers are called upon to help lead the community's grief. In parts of Nigeria, for example, there are women whose job is to cry on behalf of the family, especially if the death was sudden or tragic. They not only cry, they tell stories, invoke the ancestors, and sometimes challenge the spirits who might have caused the death. Here too, mourning is performance, but also power, a link between the living, the dead, and the spirit world. Why so universal? Why would cultures so different, with different gods, different values, and different histories, all come up with the same strange idea? Because while the details change, the emotional need does not. Humans do not grieve easily in silence. We want the world to know that we've lost someone. We want the loss to feel real, to sound real, to be shared. And sometimes, that sharing needs help. Sometimes it needs structure, ceremony, and volume. Sometimes it needs a voice trained to weep when ours cannot. A voice that cries so we can remain still, or cries so we don't have to cry alone. Professional mourners in Greece, in Egypt, in India, in Vietnam were never just performers. They were emotional surrogates, cultural tools, translators of grief. And though modern funerals are often quieter, more private, and more controlled, the memory of those public, powerful cries still echoes across time. Because grief, even when silent, still carries the weight of 1,000 voices. We often think of grief as private, a quiet ache, a silent absence behind closed doors. But in ancient societies, especially in places like Greece, Egypt, or China, grief wasn't hidden. It was performed. It was shared. And, most importantly, it was expected to be seen. Over time, mourning became more than a ritual. It became a public culture, one where sorrow didn't whisper, it echoed. In ancient Greece, a funeral wasn't just a family's farewell. It was a moment of social display, of identity, of honor. People gathered not just to mourn the dead, but to watch the mourning. The louder the cries, the more prestigious the loss. The more mourners present, hired or not, the greater the legacy of the deceased. Grief became a measurement, not of how you felt, but of how much the person was worth, in memory, in social standing, in noise. At its core, this wasn't manipulation. It wasn't about pretending to be sad. It was about acknowledging that emotion has weight, and when shared in public, that weight could shape memory. Mourning was communal, and in many cases, it had to be. Because in a world without photographs, obituaries, or news headlines, how else would the community know someone had mattered? The answer: they'd know by the volume. They'd know by the procession. They'd know by the tears on the street, the torn garments, the dust thrown into the air. Grief then became a kind of cultural theatre, not fake, but stylized, not shallow, but codified. You could walk down a street, and from the sound alone, tell what kind of person had died. A warrior? The cries might be proud, even defiant. A young child? The wailing might be softer, more broken, more tender. An elder? The rhythm might be slower, deeper, more reflective. Mourning became a language, and everyone knew how to read it. Even those who didn't know the deceased could take part. Neighbors came to weep. Distant relatives came to show face. Hired mourners came to lead the rhythm. And for a few hours, or a day, or several days, grief didn't belong to the family anymore. It belonged to the city, to the village, to the people. In this way, sorrow wasn't just a response to death. It was a tool of memory. The louder the grief, the longer the name stayed alive. This is why some families invested heavily in the mourning process, hiring many mourners, extending the funeral rituals, even arranging anniversaries of the death with new performances, not because they were obsessed with tragedy, but because they understood the public value of sorrow. Grief also played a social function. It reminded people that life was fragile. It reconnected the living to tradition. It pulled neighbors out of their homes and into each other's presence. And for those who mourned loudly, it gave permission for others to feel, to cry openly, to scream if needed, to not be okay in public. In a way, mourning became emotional infrastructure, a support system built into the culture, accessible, expected, respected. But like all public performances, mourning also had its rules. Too little emotion? You were cold. Too much? You were undignified. Too quiet? You must not have loved them. Too dramatic? You were making it about yourself. It was a delicate balance, and families were judged by how well they walked it. So they turned to professionals, to women who knew how to weep just enough, loudly, but with grace, rhythmically, but not wildly, beautifully, but never selfishly. This public grief wasn't limited to Greece. As we've seen, many cultures developed their own versions of shared mourning. But the pattern is consistent. Over and over, throughout history, humans have turned private pain into public ritual, because when someone dies, they leave a silence. And in every corner of the world, people have tried to fill that silence with sound. So yes, grief became public culture, a culture of noise, of rhythm, of bodies bent in sorrow, of voices cracking with pain, of streets echoing with names that still mattered. And in that culture, mourning was not just accepted, it was respected, it was expected. It was, in a way, beautiful. A community's way of saying, together, we feel this, we carry this, we remember. In ancient Greece, women were not meant to be heard. Their voices were not welcomed in the courts, not on the political stage, not in the public square. They were kept inside, behind walls, behind rules, behind centuries of silence. But at funerals, everything changed. For a brief moment, in death, women could speak. And not just speak, but shout, sing, cry, scream. They became the loudest voices in the city, and no one dared tell them to stop. It's a strange paradox. In life, women were expected to be modest, obedient, quiet. Their movements were limited. Their names were rarely spoken in public. Their opinions were not recorded. But when someone died, the silence cracked. And in that crack, women rushed in with sound. At Greek funerals, women took center stage. They led the mourning procession. They stood closest to the body. They performed the rituals of sorrow, tearing hair, beating the chest, calling the name of the dead into the wind. It was not chaos. It was not rebellion. It was tradition. And within that tradition, they were given power, for a day, for a moment, to express everything that daily life asked them to suppress. Some of these women were family, daughters, wives, sisters. Others were hired professionals, but all of them carried the same burden: to make grief visible, to speak where no one else could. In some ways, they became the public voice of the private world. Men may have built the monuments, they may have written the laws, but women sang the final chapter, and the society accepted it because they needed it. The female voice, so often restricted, was suddenly seen as essential. It gave the funeral ceremony emotion, weight and shape. Without it, the ritual felt incomplete. Without the cries, the tearing, the rhythmic wailing, grief was considered too quiet to be meaningful. And so, women who could not speak at a symposium could cry beside a coffin. Women who were not allowed to testify in court could testify to sorrow in full view of the city. There was structure to it, of course. Even in mourning, women had rules to follow. They could cry, but not too long. They could perform sorrow, but not disrupt the social order. But still, it was more space than they were ever given elsewhere. More than just space, it was a spotlight. In those moments, all eyes were on them. Their voices echoed through stone streets. Their gestures were watched and remembered. And when they cried, they weren't only crying for the dead. They were crying for a life lived behind curtains, for the words they were never allowed to say, for the thoughts they were told to hide. Many historians believe that women poured their identities into mourning because it was one of the few public performances of self that society allowed. They couldn't be poets. They couldn't be philosophers. They couldn't be leaders. But for one day, they could be seen, and heard, and felt. Some of the most powerful lamentations were composed not by men, but by women, passed down through oral tradition. These laments were more than cries. They were poetry, memory, and resistance. Women sang of love, of loss, of injustice. They turned funerals into stages where personal history could unfold, line by line. It's telling that in many societies, women's role in mourning was later restricted, even banned. Perhaps it was because they were too loud. Perhaps they made people uncomfortable. Perhaps their sorrow reminded others of everything that had been silenced. But the sound didn't go away. It simply moved inward. It stayed alive in lullabies, in laments, in the way grandmothers whispered names in the dark. Because once you've been allowed to speak, even briefly, you do not forget the sound of your own voice. And so, we remember this. In a world where women were not allowed to speak freely, they made their voices known in the one place no one could stop them, at the edge of death. They mourned with their whole bodies. They spoke without fear. They held grief in their palms and let it fall like coins, like ash, like rain. They were not quiet. They were not passive. They were not invisible. They were the echo after the last breath. And even now, we can still hear them in every ritual, every chant, every cry that says, "This life mattered. I will not let it disappear." Grief is one of the most personal emotions we know, but in the ancient world, it was never just personal. In ancient Greece, and in cultures far beyond it, mourning was a shared event, a ritual, a performance, and, at times, a job. Professional mourners, often women, took on a role that was both sacred and theatrical. They wept not only for the dead, but for the living, for families who needed to show the world that someone had mattered, that a life had weight, that a loss had depth. What may seem strange to us now, hiring someone to cry, was once a way to make sorrow visible, to give it shape, to give it voice. Emotion was not hidden. It was expressed fully, with rhythm, movement, and even choreography. And through these rituals, communities came together, not just to remember the person who had died, but to reaffirm what it meant to be human in the face of death. Behind every tear, there was tradition. Behind every cry, there was culture. And behind every mourning woman, there was a long line of others who had cried before her, for strangers, for family, for the sake of the ritual itself. This practice reminds us that grief is not always quiet. Sometimes it needs to be loud. Sometimes it needs to be shared. And sometimes it needs help. Whether it was a hired mourner in Athens, a Rudali in Rajasthan, or a singer in the Vietnamese countryside, each carried sorrow for others. Each turned mourning into meaning. Today, the practice may be rare, but the impulse remains. We still seek ways to express what we cannot say. We still gather. We still cry. We still honor. And in doing so, we echo the past, where grief was not just felt, it was performed, together,